Welcome to The Debate. Today, we're digging into a really profound philosophical and biological reframing from our source material. We're looking at concepts like neurodegeneration and microbial exchange, but pushing them past the usual clinical models of loss or failure.
Right, into a much more posthuman space.
Exactly.
And so the core disagreement we're going to explore is this. Does all this radical evidence, everything from neurological collapse to something like a microbiome transplant, does it primarily show that life is defined by, let's say, static recursion and managed decay? Or does it actually demonstrate a capacity for something much more active, something like transformative rewriting?
A kind of xenogeneic emergence.
Yes. And I'll be arguing for the primacy of those recursive limits, that what looks like transformation is really just the system finding its boundary.
And I am going to argue that the plasticity described here, this profound integration of the microbial and the host, points decisively toward an ontological rewriting, and that the body is actually built to anticipate radical transformation.
Okay. So for me, my position starts with this idea that biological failures, like neurodegeneration, aren't just these regrettable interruptions of life. They're actually structural revelations of life's inherent limits. The text describes it not as some slow decline, but as a mechanism. It calls it a deliberate flooring of cognition, a flattening of neuropossibility into static recursion. And that phrasing is just key for me. The standard humanistic view is that complexity is being lost. But what this material suggests is that complexity is being forcibly reduced back to a fundamental operational grammar. When you look at the transcripts from subjects going through this, you see, and I'm quoting, error text proliferates where meaning collapses. This isn't just noise. It's a structural function that reveals that cognition isn't mastery, it's managed decay. It's a paradox, right? Vitality only emerges as a side effect of this recursive constraint. So life persists not by growing endlessly, but through reiteration, by returning again and again to the point where meaning fails and metabolism can just continue. The boundary is everything.
I struggle with that conclusion, that the boundary is the ultimate defining factor. I mean, of course, physical constraint is real. I can't deny that. But the evidence for an active, almost alien transformation is just too compelling to ignore. For me, the capacity to be fundamentally rewritten is what defines this post-human life. Just look at fecal microbiota transplantation, FMT. The source material takes this way beyond a simple clinical procedure. It actually frames FMT as an ontological splice. You're not just swapping microbes, you're splicing a new system of meaning into the host. The gut becomes a grammar, and the microbial exchange, it's its syntax. I mean, that's fundamentally destabilizing to any idea of a static self. When the body's metabolism fails, inheritance stops being purely reproductive. It becomes archival, ghostly, which allows for this total reorganization through what's called necrosignaling. And yes, that signal is tied to failure, I get that, but it leads to a completely novel structural arrangement. That's not managed decay, that's managed rewriting.
Okay, I see why you're leaning so heavily on the linguistic metaphor there, the grammar and syntax, but I'd argue the power lies precisely in the constraint that forces this reconfiguration. The system isn't, freely choosing a new language. It's being structurally compelled to reestablish function. Let's just go back to that evidence, that error text proliferates where meaning collapses. To me, that shows degeneration as a forced process. It's like an automated damage control protocol, not some intentional act of remastery or active genesis. This posthuman whole, this site of failure, is defined as text, medium, and symptom. It's a site of repetition, forcing the system back to its pre-programmed boundaries to make sure metabolism continues. If the system were truly generative, we'd see synthesis, wouldn't we? Not just this recurring loop of error text. The recursion is the survival mechanism.
That's a compelling way to put it, but I think you're defining recurrence too narrowly. I agree that the interruption, the collapse of meaning, is necessary. But those interruptions are just the conditions that activate this rewriting capacity. They're not the essence of persistence itself. I mean, if life were really defined by static recurrence, the ontological splice of FMT wouldn't just be a fix. It would be rejected as, incompatible structural noise. The fact that it works so well shows the body is ready to absorb new forms. The material talks about fluid codons, colonizing beyond tradition. A codon, a fundamental genetic unit, is now described as fluid, capable of colonizing outside inherited tradition. So the physical body can accept a new language being imposed on it, achieving a shift in relational timing that goes way beyond simple static constraint. It's not a return to the old language. It's the acquisition of a new one.
But doesn't that acquisition still have to operate within the topological boundaries of the host system? Okay, let's move this to the micro level for a second, to our second point, the question of agency. You argue for the cell's inherent capacity for transformation. I argue that capacity is still rigidly bounded.
And I think the evidence for active transformation starts right there, at the cellular level. The material is explicit. It says cells demand internal premonition. They aren't passive little machines waiting for instructions from some central command. They anticipate transformation. And this anticipatory state, it's a really radical idea because it implies this active, non-hierarchical agency. Interaction is governed through folds, not rigid chains of command. The text even connects this topology to Jacob Boehm's paideia of seduction, a messy, complex, nonlinear dynamic. This agency is what enables S-innovation, a sacramental excess that exceeds pleasure. This excess isn't just wasted energy. It's a mechanism that stores innovation, carving out new potential that exists beyond the limits of inherited identity. If vitality were just a side effect of constraint, why would this deliberate sequestered innovation capacity even exist?
I struggle with calling that internal premonition true agency. It still seems functionally bound to metabolic imperatives. To define this anticipation as agency, you have to fundamentally overlook the structural boundaries that dictate where that vitality can even be expressed. Sure, the cell anticipates, but the overarching reality, as I see it, is that vitality emerges only as a side effect of constraint. The anticipation is just a highly tuned mechanism for maximizing survival inside a predefined box. And we see this complexity in the communication pathways of systems like Aspergillus or Giardia. The analysis shows that communication itself is profoundly metabolic. It passes through walls not as some philosophical proposition, but as a symptom, as fear, as metabolic instability. It's conditioned, it's structural, it's inherently constrained. It screams limits, not unbounded generative capacity. Even the evidence you brought up, the enteric nervous system, it's described as governing interaction through folds, which to me just reinforces the idea of bounded recursion within a contained reality, a maze you have to navigate, not transcend.
But the difference is critical, isn't it? A fold is a site of reorganization, where a boundary is a fixed limit. And when you describe communication as fear or symptom, you're only describing the mechanism of the interaction, not its result. The result is the possibility of the xenogeneic. If the system is so strictly constrained, then why does the material spend so much time linking Bataille's ideas of excess, convulsion, and erotic negativity to microbial strategies?
Exactly. Let's dig into that for a third point, because I think it grounds my argument perfectly. The material links Bataille's concept of excess directly to microbial strategies for survival, which suggests that what we see as dynamism or convulsion or, philosophical transformation is actually just a violent structural mechanism for maintaining iteration within a system that's resisting total closure. Excess isn't transcendence, it's the engine of a necessary process. The transmission of sexual struggle as platform vocabulary is explicitly routed through technological motherboards. So struggle is defined as a technological process, a necessary loop, not a philosophical escape from limits. At the micro level, metabolic genes transmit process, not meaning. Survival is the recurrence, even if it's an explosive or convulsive one. The posthuman condition in this reading is just the continuous violent work required to prevent a complete shutdown.
I'll admit the connection to Bataille is powerful evidence for the violence of survival, but focusing only on the process misses what that excess produces. The source material introduces a concept that directly challenges this idea of rigid iteration, the psychogametoton.
And what's the implication of that, this complex concept?
The psychogametogen is defined as a functional hybrid. It's the successful fusion of social reproduction logic and microbial logic, and it emerges specifically as a catalytic reference point for xenogeneic capability. This is more than just maintaining a loop. Xenogenesis means generating new material from a non-host source. The text uses the analogy of the transaction of a soul, which you have to read as an allegory for how ecosystems are built, not just for persistence, but for transcending a dual existence. The system is built to actively incorporate the alien. The vole's body, for example, is described as already microbiologically plural. The separation between host and organism is expressed as a duality in proteins. This persistent capability for fusion, for rewriting, what the material calls molecular impermanent styling life. It suggested dynamism driven by potential and by incorporating the other, not just by the rigidity of recursion. It points to a constant readiness for reorganization.
I would argue that readiness for reorganization is still bound by the laws of functional viability. The structure of the psychogametogen might be novel, but its purpose is still the management of viability. If you look at the mechanics, this hybrid structure ensures functional alignment through heterogeneous poetic reconstructions. It's a highly complex solution to a structural problem. I think it's the ultimate expression of managed decay, taking external, xenogenic material and bending it to serve the system's imperative for recursive survival. If it truly achieved transcendence, it wouldn't need to align functionally at all. It has to keep returning to the task of system maintenance.
But the very fact that it integrates a fundamentally different alien logic, that molecular genetic dates matter less than relational timing, that shows the system has sacrificed its structural purity for potential. Relational timing, the ability to reorganize dynamically, is the antithesis of static recurrence. If life were strictly governed by fixed constraints, there'd be no way to prioritize immediate relational need over inherited genetic fidelity. This system is actively designed to incorporate the alien, and this openness, this capacity for the ontological splice, defines the posthuman body as perpetually being rewritten.
And I still maintain that the rewriting you're describing is just the system finding the most structurally efficient way back to its core, constrained iteration. The grammar of life, for me, is ultimately defined by constraint. Neurodegeneration shows the structural necessity of managed decay, of static recursion. And while these highly complex transformations happen, FMT, hybrid forms, they are at their core mechanisms for reiteration, forcing the system back to viable boundaries. The posthuman condition isn't revealed in some explosive novelty, but in the quiet, relentless grammar of recurrence that's already at work within us, defining persistence through necessary limits.
The ontological splice, the cell's internal premonition, the psychogametogen, all of it shows that potential outweighs structural rigidity. The complexity of microbial semiotics allows for a transcendence of dual existence, making the posthuman condition one of xenogeneic potential and continual transformation, not just repetition. Life isn't defined by its constraints, but by its capacity to absorb and anticipate the new.
So it's clear we're working from the same foundational evidence, this really intimate relationship between a failure of meaning and metabolic persistence, but we're framing it through fundamentally distinct lenses. Necessary structural boundary versus the potential for a radical rewriting.
Exactly, and the conversation leaves us with, I think, a profound acknowledgement of the body's folded realities. And, well, so much more to explore in how these complex, non-immune triggers operate to either compel iteration or perhaps catalyze real transformation.